Hello and welcome to episode number 15 of the Strength Coach Roundtable on RowingChat. We have a brief word from our sponsors before we get going on our content for today. First is from the Rowing Tales book. Do you ever want a fun short story about rowing to fill a quiet moment? Maybe you read in bed or while waiting in the car for your kids. Well, Rebecca Caro has been busy collecting stories from readers and coaches which you are going to love reading. Her Rowing Tales book is an anthology, a collection of short stories, and each one has a rowing theme. Some are from famous names, many are from athletes and coaches just like you and me. There are 3 books, one published each year since 2017, and you can find them on Amazon. The next is from the Kregel rowing camps. Are you a master's rower who lacks consistent coaching? Would you like to learn how you could row faster? The Kregel rowing camps is for you. These camps offer coaching by experienced world-class coaches working in a small group, so you're guaranteed to get personalized recommendations, video analysis, learning how to work with data, training and competing in new wind tech and fluid design boats, rowing on quiet 3-kilometer-long rowing lake in Brno, not far from Prague or Vienna. The first camp in July 2020 can be combined with competing in one of the strongest and largest Masters regattas in Europe, the Open Czech Masters Regatta. The second camp is an ideal preparation for the World Rowing Masters Regatta in nearby Offensheim, Austria. More information at pregelrowing.com/rowingchat. You can find answers about all of these sponsors at rowing.chat/sponsors. So, with that out of the way, what we're doing today is recapping the Joy of Sculling conference, which happened in December of 2019 in New York. Co-host Joe DeLeo and I presented on individual topics as well as a co-presentation. So what we're going to do is recap on our topics, provide a quick summary, and Blake Gourlay is here as well to do some Q&A with us, talk about those, and then catch up on what we've been up to. It's been almost a year since our last presentation or podcast with 3 of us. So really we're just trying to catch up, get back on the board, and talk about our presentations. So why don't we start with you guys on what's been going on with you since our last meeting here. Joe, you want to start us off?
Sure. So really 2019 probably for me in terms of what I've done in the past, I hadn't put out as much content. So, coaching really kind of overtook time and became the kind of the forefront. Both my full-time job and then also traveling internationally, heading over to Portugal, working with the team there. So that was kind of my main focus for the majority of 2019. And it started to do some more workshops, focused on, trying to reach the junior or master's population and continuing to kind of refine that and evolve the material for that workshop, and looking to do some more in 2020.
And still doing the podcast and stuff too, yeah?
Yes. Yeah. So while I didn't publish any, I have actually a ton of content in the can, so to speak. So I'll be releasing 3 interviews Sunday, Monday this week before the end of January is up. And then I actually have a whole lightweight series that I started in 2019 with several different athletes that I'll be editing and getting out sometime in February, which should be pretty cool. And then also putting together an S&C series as well with some strength and conditioning coaches that work specifically with some high performance rowing teams. So that's kind of what's coming in the pipeline.
Nice. Blake, what's up?
So a couple seasons ago, I stepped away from coaching. It was kind of too much to be coaching and doing my business, and I kind of had to choose. So it was a hard decision at the time, but I'm really, really happy that I made that decision because business has doubled. So it's been fantastic. And I've actually had time to do research and start to put content out again. And before you guys know, I was horrible. I was horrible with content and social media. So now I'm actually able to to use things that I've been using and start to think a little bit more with research and everything, combine it and start to share some info that I think is pretty cool. Will and I have worked on a couple of projects, still working on a couple of projects with the NSCA. And then I'm really putting most of my content out on my blog, Rowing Strength, and my Instagram, Rowing Strength.
Your series on the foot and ankle is up to what, like 8 or 9 parts now or something? It seems like every week facet of that.
I originally started thinking it would be like really super quick. And the more I dig into it, it's like, well, I might as well get detailed. I might as well touch every portion of it. And I think it's pretty cool. I've found some pretty interesting things. And then for Christmas, my girlfriend surprised me with a statistician, because I have all this data from movement screens that I've done over the past 6+ years. And before I just kind of looked at the data and I just assumed things. But he's able to actually look at it from a mathematical perspective. And that's been really cool and interesting. So still working with him. He's worked through the varsity men. Now he's working through the varsity women. Cool.
Because you still see rowers in your private practice, right?
Yeah. It's not 100%, but probably like 50% of my clients are rowers.
Yeah. So you're not out of the rowing game by any means. You're just not in a coach's launch anymore.
No longer coaching rowing. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I mean, I guess since our last one, I did the last podcast in June with Fiona Wilson talking about spine and low back pain in rowing. So maybe audience are a little bit more familiar with what I'm up to since from you guys it's been since February. But short notes is moved to Vermont. Most of my coaching happens at the Craftsbury Rowing Center now with their small boats, sculling, summer camp sort of programs. So also not necessarily regularly in a coach's launch, but enjoying getting to know a different side of the sport since I've been in college sweeps for the last 5 or 6 years before that. So that's been fun. Now that the water's all frozen over here in Vermont, I've just been doing a lot of online work between these presentation stuff with Joe, and as Blake mentioned, we're doing the 3-part article series for the National Strength Conditioning Association of the U.S. That's the NSCA. It's only available to NSCA members for now, but we get the rights in 6 months, so we'll be able to make it more broadly available after that. And then I've just been doing other writing and online coaching and stuff on top of that. So I think it's been fun for all three of us now. We're coming up on 4 years of working together, right? We started in 2016, so yeah, we've all sort of gone through different elements of or different phases of coaching, from being like hardcore in rowing coaching plus strength training, and then sort of morphing along through different jobs and relocations. And I guess, yeah, this is the first podcast that we're all doing from our 3 different time zones now too. So Blake's representing the West Coast, Joe's got the Midwest locked down, and I'm on the East Coast. So
yeah. Do we ever do one when I was in Providence? Or no?
I think that would have been right when we started, right? 2016.
Yeah. I think maybe potentially.
Yeah, but Blake and I were both on the West Coast. So that was just West.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Now we're really distributed.
We get the trifecta.
Yeah. I mean, this country's just not big enough for the 3 of us. That's really the problem here. All right. Well, let's see. Joe, do you want to start with your individual presentation? What we've done is just basically provide like 10-minute key points and recaps, and then we'll talk more about how you can get more information about each of our presentations later on in the end. But do you want to start with yours on the history?
Sure. So the title of the presentation was the evolution of rowing or strength and conditioning. The evolution of strength and conditioning in rowing. So what I did was I kind of took a historical viewpoint and went back as far as I could. So that ended up being in the late 1800s. And sort of the reason that I wanted to do this was, we see a lot of quote unquote traditional exercises in the sport being utilized from a S&C perspective, such as like the bench pull, which is a good one, or, back squats, or jumping back squats with the barbell on the back. So looking at that and like where did those things come from why are they sort of woven into the fabric of the sport, so much? Why is it such a big part of the tradition? So like I said, I started off looking at the late 1800s, going back into the Harvard Yale Regatta, which was really, that book was just kind of more training journals and notes from the captains. And then kind of fast forwarding into the 1950s and looked at the shock method by Verkhoshansky, which is, you're just starting to get into jump training, which depending on who you're reading, it often gets kind of lumped in with plyometrics, which was coined by Fred Wilt, a track and field coach in the U.S. So he had some specific training protocols he used for elite level oarsmen. And then it was also one of the first instances I found of the bench pull being used. And then the GDR text of oarsmanship, the original first edition, I think it was early 1970s. That's when you really started to predominantly see the bench pull circuit style training or station style training. And then how that segued into the 1980s when you started seeing a lot of the athletic development come out of FISA, and how they started to look at overall development for juniors. And so what you really started to see was this kind of pattern emerge of the emphasis of, kind of relatively lighter loads when it came to strength and conditioning and higher repetitions, which seemed to, at least growing up for me, kind of was a mainstay in how we did some type of strength and conditioning or circuit style work in high school. And even in, the mid 1980s, I came across a program Brad Allen Lewis sent me called the 22-minute drill, which was a series of essentially like 7 either power lifts / Olympic style lifts used with like a barbell or a lighter, barbell. It might have been in the mid 20-pound range or even lighter, but it was all high repetition. And so the goal of that workout was actually to finish on 22 minutes exactly. So in total, you would have been doing a few hundred repetitions. And the only thing I can come up with is that the sort of thought process, from GDR and a program like that, or a training session like that, was you're trying to do movements similar to what's involved in the rowing stroke, and replicate the amount of, strokes that you're taking during a 2K race. And then kind of fast forward, you get into the 90s and you have McNeely's work. And then I found a pretty good journal by Pat Ivey, who at the time was at the University of Missouri. It was called Strength Training for the Preparatory Phase in Collegiate Women's Rowing. And that was when you started to see a more distinct shift in approaching a strength and conditioning session. So there was a distinct power phase at the beginning of the session, and then they had a strength phase where they're doing upper lower body, some type of accessory work, focusing usually on scapular stabilization, and then some type of core work to round it out. So it was, for me, it was really interesting sort of looking at this, how do we start off? Why do we use certain exercises and their historical significance, and why have we been married to them for so long? And then also what are we doing now, and how has that evolved as overall knowledge and research in the strength and conditioning field has continued to improve over the last, 25 to 30 plus years.
One factor in that is not just that the strength and conditioning field has changed, but also that the sport of rowing has changed. And that's something that I got into in my presentation with low back pain and rib stress injuries, is that both of those injuries started ticking up in the 1990s. And that coincides with the popularization or the commercialization of the static erg and the hatchet blade. And
absolutely. There's no doubt that those two things had an effect. And
those increase the load per stroke and the volume that rowers can achieve so much that I think a lot of those historical methods of the super lightweight circuit training, like that might have had a place when you were using low loading spoons And when you couldn't just jump on the erg all off season and hammer away at specific training, so you had to find other ways to train the aerobic base, other ways to train muscular endurance. Now we have the erg. Now we have hatchet blades. I don't think we need to be doing 200 rep stuff, but like as you said, like these things are historically baked into the training culture, and there's still plenty of people who do 7-minute powerlift circuits with light loads and bench pulls and all this other stuff that like we have to question that just because they've been a part of the sport's history doesn't necessarily mean that they should be there now.
Right. And so that's a great point. I think kind of for me, I'm going to let this one continue to marinate for a little bit because I spent a lot of time probably doing more of the research end and actually like the presentation writing portion of it, because there was such a significant time period I was trying to cover. But one thing I do want to look at probably more, I'd say that our conversations both on air and off air, when we've talked a lot about the bench pull, is just coming across some of the journals. I think McNeely's talked about it, and Lawton have looked at, trying to determine if there's more of a correlation in rowing performance with the bench pull, because it's been something that's, like you said, baked into the culture for so long. Really coming out of the GDR, how it's been popularized. But I think there's also been a shift in how it's been used. I know when I was in college, that particular lift, it was, we went pretty heavy with it, but now it looks like they've try to take more of, at times, a velocity based approach where it's a lighter load relatively, but you're looking at moving the bar as fast as possible, like trying to accelerate the oar handle. And so seeing if some of those might be markers for correlation between, that and successful performance in rowing.
Yeah, and I mean, I can tell you that they are, because this is a lot of what Blake and I have been doing for this NSCA piece is reviewing the research around performance correlates, and the general scapular retraction strength, right? Like the motion of the arm pull that gets the lats and the biceps involved is correlated with improved rowing performance, and so is the leg press, right? I mean, if we can boil the stroke down to which are the two most significant parts, right? We've got leg extension and we've got torso swing and scapular retraction. So it makes sense that if we find strength measurements for those tests or for those movements, then sure, the strongest rowers are going to be among the fastest rowers. Whether or not there's a correlation, though, doesn't mean that there's a causation, right? That
Sure.
More training on the bench pull doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get any better at rowing just because there's a correlation there. And I think that's where a lot of coaches have gotten lost. I think it's also a factor too that what's the most standardized way that we can test scapular retraction and arm flexion strength? It's the bench pull. You have the athlete lying there. The bar starts from a dead stop. You pull it up until it hits a click on a bench. So the fact that it's easy to assess and it's easy to coach, right? It takes essentially no experience. Lie down on the bench, pull the bar toward you. Means that it can be highly used. That doesn't mean that it should be highly used. It just means that it's there, therefore we've studied it. So I know we talked recently about the research review that I did on the Lawton piece, looking at the Concept 2 dynamometer, the older they were producing from, I guess those aren't in production anymore. I think they stopped in 2007 or something. But so he looked at like the arm pull with that and found, okay, same thing, that we could be very consistent with testing 5 rep max on the C2 dynamometer. So maybe that's a better way to do it. We got to see if there's a connection to 2K performance. But I think that's where we get into like the chicken and the egg stuff with testing, is just because it can be tested doesn't necessarily mean that it should be trained.
No, 100%. Yeah, I think, and everything you just touched on there, those are kind of some of the next questions is, okay, we know there's a link there between rowing performance, but what are better ways to train that skill or that inherent quality, and especially from a safety perspective, because there definitely is more of an inherent risk, especially with rib injuries on the bench pull.
Yeah.
So Yeah, it's exciting. I'm looking forward to that piece when it gets published.
Blake, any thoughts on that general discussion?
Yeah, I think to add to that point, if we were to measure any sort of pulling motion like a dumbbell row, even though it's not standardized, it probably shows a similar correlation, right?
But it just depends how can we make the testing consistent and accurate, right?
Right. Like, could we squat instead of leg press? Probably. It would probably show a similar correlation. But yeah, the standardization is the problem.
Yeah.
So completely on board with your guys' thought process.
So it sort of becomes that discussion of like, what is the value of having the test? Is it just the best test that we can do, or is the test actually giving us valuable information? But
yeah, you know, one thing, because we've talked a lot about this, and I know you've written about this extensively in terms of just, you know, one RM testing and sort of the risk reward, and not to go too much on a tangent, but one thing I've been trying to think about more is how can we, for rowing, try to get some performance metrics that we can do on a consistent basis that are repeatable, that we can start tying to rowing performance, that don't have probably as much inherent, you know, safety or risk involved.
That's why I like that C2 dyno idea, because there's no eccentric phase, there's no risk of the athlete getting pinned under a bar or anything.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That was my thought. No,
yeah, but totally we got to see if those actually connect to rowing performance. So that's what that's what that article didn't do is say, okay, we can be very consistent with the leg press and the arm pull. Now we don't know if there's actually a connection to 2K performance. So we might be testing that just for the sake of testing that, but without knowing if it actually contributes to who is or isn't a better rower because of it.
For sure.
Yeah, I feel like a good safe one too that should be included is grip strength.
Yeah, and I know you've been doing a lot of work on that.
Yeah, it's just it's interesting because just like the bench pull, people are like, okay, let's do more bench pulls. That's going to make me a better rower. Wrong thought process, right? Like grip is measuring alignment. Grip is measuring like overall health and wellness, right? And that's why it's been associated with so many interesting things like longevity and lung function and actually rowing performance. So that's a safe one that I think people can use. And that's actually something the statistician found from my data, that the top 8 rowers were significantly higher in grip strength.
But you wouldn't necessarily recommend that rowers go out and spend a ton of time squeezing those little hand grippers, right?
Right. I would never recommend that.
So it's not. So that's sort of the same idea of like, just because this is a variable in testing means that we can look at it as a test, but you wouldn't necessarily train for that test, right?
Right. I would use it. I would use it as feedback to see if my training was helping and improving grip strength. And I think it also shows you readiness, right? So if someone's completely worn down, their grip drops.
Hey Blake, question for you on that. So in regards to the grip strength, could you also potentially use that as a marker to start seeing if there was a pretty significant discrepancy between the left and right side, and seeing if that could potentially be an issue down the line in terms of, you know, shoulder or scapular, or, not looking too far, but maybe rib, if there's a significant discrepancy?
Yeah, I haven't looked super far that way, but I have seen a lot of rowers with asymmetries in their grip.
Yeah.
And it's typically tied to that shoulder, right? If they don't have really strong grip in their left hand, their left shoulder usually had some sort of previous issue or maybe something coming up. I've looked more at it from a readiness perspective and a performance perspective. But I think
like nervous system.
Yeah, but I think it can be used that way for sure.
Cool.
So my presentation was on low back pain and rib stress injury research in rowing, and it was fun for me to do this conference and the presentation on this topic, because it's been something that I've been working on for the last at least 18 months now, starting with 2 years ago when I was still at Western Washington University, and we had a new head coach come in with a high volume, high load, heavy erg training program. We got more low back pain and rib stress injuries in that one season or that one training year than I'd seen in my previous 5 years with the program total. And at that same time, I was still in grad school. I was in a biomechanics class and we had to do a final project on a literature review of some coaching topic of interest to us with an emphasis in biomechanics. So I sort of wanted to know, like, I had my own ideas for why these injuries were ticking up, but I wanted to know what the academic research had to say on it. And so what I found is that, yes, these injuries are very common in rowing. So for low back pain, it's 32 to 53% of rowers in a training year based on the available research we have on injury rates. There's any number of reasons that could be underreported or overreported, but he's kind of the trust that the research has done the best job to try to control all those factors. Rib stress injuries are fewer, more like 10 to 12% of rowers in a training year, but low back pain causes the highest frequency of missed training sessions, and rib stress injuries causes the longest time per injury missed of training and racing. Because it's a bone injury, it takes a lot longer to recover. So even though it affects fewer rowers, I think it's possibly more damaging in terms of, like, they were reporting up to 47 to 60 days missed from a rib stress injury, just because bone has so much less blood flow and takes longer to recover. So the key factors related are volume, load, and progression of volume and load. So because rowing doesn't, I used to coach lacrosse too, and we would have traumatic injuries because someone would get hit really hard. We don't have that in rowing. So most of the injury mechanics are under our direct control, or the injury risks are under our direct control as coaches. And it has to do with how hard we're pushing athletes, what the per stroke load is, and how ready those athletes are, or what the progression was. So there's some interesting findings there. There was one study that looked at New Zealand rowers that charted their total training hours against their incidences of low back pain. And you could see this huge spike. The training must go up like threefold in between their last month of the off season and their first month of their like return back to training. The seasons are upside down, but basically for the US, it would be like the difference from August off season to September in season. And the low back pain incidence goes exactly up, like basically proportional with that increase in training volume. It's just too much too quickly. So what I really found to be the major factors is minimizing high and high overlap. So if we're going to have high training load, high per stroke load due to specific training factors, then we should either reduce load elsewhere or reduce training volume, right? So we're just trying to minimize areas where we're doing high load and high volume, especially if there's a rapid progression. But so like a couple of examples of training load in the rowing stroke are, like we talked about, using hatchets versus using spoons, using static ergs versus using dynamic ergs. Those both exert higher per stroke load on the athlete. So because the stroke force has to go through the entire kinetic chain from ankles to hands, more load on the athlete means more load on the spine and the ribs. So we could reduce training volume elsewhere by either using cross training for aerobic base, or just simply reducing training volume. Because if we're training harder on a per stroke basis, then again, I think we've got to look at, like, are the same training volumes that we used to do in rowing still necessary to be doing now? And then if volume is high, like there's a productive value to doing high volume training, particularly with regard to like aerobic adaptations. Can we reduce load elsewhere? So can we use dynamic ergs instead of static ergs? Or even if you still have spoons, can you use spoons instead of hatchets just to reduce load on the athlete, so that they can do the higher volume training without burning the candle at both ends, without both doing high load and high volume. And I think we can also plan for and monitor sensitive training times. So like when athletes return from breaks from training or after the holidays time, we should be decreasing load and or volume and then gradually building up from there in a progressive way. And I think a lot of these things, like, we have known, but it was particularly helpful to have it in the academic research, be able to review those, see the findings across multiple studies, and then start producing those and presenting them to the rowing coaches. And one question that came up in the presentation was like, well, what do we do with training camps then? Because we've got this time when we're on the water 3 days a week or 3 times a day, maybe for a week or 2 weeks on a holiday trip, or like when you're getting ready for a big regatta. And I think it's the same thing. Like, let's not hammer the athlete with a ton of static erg work, a ton of low rate, or like rowing at 8 by pairs is a lot of increased per stroke load. So we can just find ways to manipulate the volume and load so that we're not working the athlete on both sides. What I also wanted to present was like not just what the rowing relevant risk factors are, but what the athlete and what the rowing coach, what the strength coach can all be doing better to work together on that. And what the research showed is that we need more coach athlete education on low back pain rehab. Pretty much everybody knows when their back hurts. That's partially because it's so common in rowing, but that's also partially because of the simplicity of the injury compared to the rib stress injury. What we need to do is to get away from the idea of like the back strain, or that we can just row through it, because those aren't long-term solutions. So if an athlete presents with low back pain, I think they have to understand that there's a technical factor that probably needs to be addressed. The coach needs to understand that there's a volume or load factor that needs to be addressed, at least with that athlete. Because even with this high volume, high load training at Western, like not every athlete got injured. So there were obviously some individual factors that predispose certain athletes over others to getting hurt. So at least for that athlete, there's too much volume and load going on. So let's find other ways that the rower can still work hard and stay in shape while the back recovers, and then gradually progress back to full speed, full pressure rowing, while also working on whatever underlying technical factor might have set them up for that injury. On rib stress injury, it's sort of the other way. We need more education on what the risk factors are and what the diagnosing the symptoms are, because athletes don't always know like what a rib stress injury is. It's way more common in rowing than it is in other areas, because we're putting so much supporting load on the rib cage with each stroke. And the story that I always think of with this is the first time that I started writing about rib stress injuries, which is I think around when we started the podcast time. I wrote up the article on it, like, here's the symptoms, here's the risk factors, here's what we could do as strength coaches. And then that next week, I had an athlete at Western come to me and say, like, hey, I read your article, and I actually think that I might have like some rib pain going on. So I wasn't doing a good enough job in my own house of educating athletes on like what that pain is and what it means. Because it's more insidious than low back pain. It tends to come on slowly, particularly like around like the red flags are point specific pain on the anterior chest wall, especially the middle and lower ribs, and especially pain when breathing deeply, coughing or sneezing, pulling on doors when the arm is stretched out and the athlete's pulling the door towards them, or side sleeping because they're in this sort of cramped over position. It is often misdiagnosed as an intercostal strain or a cartilage tear, because those are more common things in general populations. But that's where the education is really important for the doctors as well. That like that's a specific risk factor or injury risk for rowing, when in a general population it probably is an intercostal strain, but in a rowing population it's probably a rib stress injury. And it might or might not show up on imaging, so that makes it tough too if you send an athlete in for an x-ray. I had one doctor in one of my presentations who says that he doesn't send athletes in for imaging during the first week of rib pain. He's like, there's too much trauma in the area. Whatever it is going to be inconclusive. So just offload the athlete for that first week. See if the pain starts to subside. If the pain doesn't subside, or if it comes back when you start to rebuild, he's like, then that's when you start to get more worried about it. That's when the really good time for imaging is, or an x-ray, like after that first week, if there's still general pain. So then from there, it's just a matter of progressively rebuilding. We had a couple athletes, both with low back pain and with rib stress injury, who were just progressed way too quick. So the rule of thumb is like 10% of volume per week, but that's a really slow progression, and it's sort of hard to manage as a coach, especially when you've got on water rowing going on, because like, how do I add 10% of meters or time per week when I've got an 8 rowing out? So there's some specific challenges too that I think you just got to start talking about with the rowing coach, strength coach, athlete whole kind of combination. And then one particular finding, I mean, this is the strength coach roundtable, so to talk about it from a strength training perspective too, is that strength and muscle are protective. So if we can distribute stroke force across muscles, then we can reduce the stress and strain on the skeleton. So where if the athlete has a technical fault or they're too fatigued so they can't keep their technique together and they start rounding the back, shoving the shoulder out, doing all these typical errors, that's putting more load on the skeletal structures and less load distributed across the muscular structures. So we want stroke force to be distributed across muscles. That means the athlete needs to be developed muscularly so that they can maintain those good technical positions. And then one exciting thing coming up on that is the World Rowing Low Back Pain Pathway. It was something that Fiona Wilson, who's one of the researchers on that, and I talked about in our podcast back in June. She was thinking it might be out by like December 2019. It's still not. I think now they're thinking like spring 2020. So that'll be on World Rowing when it's available. But the value of that, they already have one for rib stress injuries, which is developed by two rower clinician researchers associated with the Team Great Britain for rib stress injuries that basically takes you from like risk factors to accurate diagnosis to rehab to return to rowing. And so having this pathway laid out for both the athlete as well as the coach and the strength coach and the clinician, so you can take this to a doctor and say, hey, here's the relevant information for my sport for what I'm doing. Can you help me with this, to kind of bring the medical community in on what we're doing too. So sorry I went a little long there, but that's the summary of the research on the two injuries. Questions, comments, snide remarks?
Snide remarks. Yeah, well, it sounds like I missed good presentations from both of you, so thanks for doing that.
Well, it was a long way away from you, so.
Joe, one question which doesn't have a lot to do with the content, but how did you find all that information, especially back in the 80s? That's super fascinating.
Yeah. So great question. So some of it was from some books. Some of it is just, I think it's materials that I've kind of collected over the years and have held on to. So, like good example is like 22-minute drill from like Brad Allen Lewis. He had sent that to me a few years back. And as I was just kind of researching this stuff, I was digging through my files and found that. Another thing I did was I reached out to the curators at the Thames River and Rowing Museum in UK. And they have a lot of digital historical files from the 1980s and early 1990s from FISA. So during that time period, at least in my understanding, because I was still really young then, but that's when FISA really started to look at coaching education and athletic development and putting out sort of a consensus, statement, or they started to have coaching conferences. And so a lot of that, from my understanding, came from Tor Nielsen, or some of his work, and working with the executive team and staff at FISA to do that. And so, some of that knowledge was directly, pulled from FISA. And what's interesting is as they put those materials together, like what kept bubbling up for me was seeing the influence from the GDR. So that definitely has had a very predominant kind of influence, I think, in rowing overall. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you look at, coaching trees out there, Jürgen Grobler is at Great Britain. He's been there for, 3 decades now. He's from GDR. So you can sort of see where the influences kind of come from.
Joe, during your research, did you find anything that talked about like standardizations of squats and how people should be doing the same squats, or standardization of deadlift heights? Did you get into any of that? Like why we deadlift from the floor?
Nothing. No, I didn't find anything on standardization of, foot width or height. I know we all have our kind of thoughts on that now. And that's certainly changed, I think, a lot in the last 10 to 15 years as we've gotten more information about low back and hip health and, pulling from blocks versus pulling from the floor and taking into consideration, the height of the athlete and, leg length versus torso length and that type of thing. But nothing in terms of like standards, for those types of lifts. At least I didn't find in my research. I'm not saying it's not out there, but I didn't come across it.
It is hard. I remember this is one of the things we talked about as you were getting going on it, that like we've got to get off the internet for a lot of this information, that like talking to curators, talking to people who were there as far back in rowing history as we can go, and trying to find, original source textbooks on training manuals is just a different level of research than what maybe we're used to now with academics and blogs and all that stuff being available.
It's totally different, man. I mean, it's such a great point. That's what was probably the biggest challenge was pulling from like multiple areas and multiple sources across, 100 and whatever, 120, 150 years.
Yeah. But it's valuable to preserve. And so I'm looking forward to when you can get some of the stuff up on your blog to make it easier for, the next person to come along.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll get a post up probably in the next few weeks on this particular presentation. But one other thing, just from a conversation, as I was talking to one of the Portuguese coaches, it was interesting. Like when he was rowing, so this is probably 20 years ago. So think, early mid 90s, he told me they used to do a bench pull test and it was 40% of their 1 RM. And you would be trying to get, I forget exactly, X number of repetitions for 7 minutes straight.
This right. So my high school coach did this too.
Right. So again, like you see this.
And she rode in the early 2000s, so it wasn't even that long ago. Yeah.
So this mindset of trying to replicate a similar type of movement or movement pattern that is, present in the rowing stroke, adding some type of load to it, and you're trying to do it for the time amount of time or close to amount of time for the 2K race. Right?
But it doesn't make any sense because you don't row with just your arms. I mean, you do if you're an adaptive rower in a certain class, but that's the problem with it is like we've taken the complex parts of the stroke out, and we're trying to replicate this and say that this means that you're rowing. You're not rowing. You like when you row, you're using your legs and your glutes and your torso to transmit force, not 100%. Just lying there on a padded bench yanking a bar towards you.
Yep.
The reason I asked about the deadlift, and I'm probably going to butcher this story a little bit. But I took the pain-free performance specialist certification with Dr. Resson. And he told us this story about, he's like, do you guys know why we deadlift from the floor?
We talked about this in our co-presentation, but go for it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. You and I did.
Joe and I did in our co-presentation at Joy of Sculling.
Oh, you did talk about this?
Yeah.
Okay.
But no, you do it.
So I don't know how long ago, but probably back when Joe was researching we used to lift with these bars that didn't have weights that were on them, right? They're just bars with kind of like these big circles on the end of them. And people would be doing snatches, Olympic lifts, and they'd be overhead and they would drop the bar and people were dying from it because they would get crushed by the bar. So what happened was they measured the height of an average person's head. They added like half an inch or so. And then that's the height of the plate that we now use on barbells. So now people think like, if I can't deadlift from the floor, there's something wrong with me, or I'm not training correctly, et cetera, when it was actually just to prevent death years ago.
Just a safety mechanism. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. We dropped this in our co-presentation because we were talking about modifying exercises and making them an appropriate fit for the athletes and sort of getting away from, just like you said, that idea of exercise purity. We have to be able to do full depth ass to grass back squats, and we have to be able to do perfect conventional deadlifts from the floor and push-ups from our hands and feet all the way down to the ground. And it's just, if you've got athletes of different builds and different strengths, then that doesn't necessarily make any sense. So, but we use that same thing to illustrate the point for like why methods become methods is not always because they're the best methods, but just because they're the safest or they're the most available.
And that ties directly into our co-presentation when we start talking about principles and the principle of individualization. right? So trying to put the athlete, everybody might be, deadlifting. We've been talking about that, but are you individualizing their foot position? Are you individualizing if they're doing a conventional or sumo barbell deadlift versus a trap bar deadlift, or are they doing a barbell deadlift, but is it from blocks, right? So there's so many different ways to skin the cat, but putting the athlete in a position where they're getting the benefit from the lift, but they're also in a position where they're comfortable and safe, especially for their structure and hip architecture.
And if you want to compare yourself against conventional deadlifters, then go compete in powerlifting. Don't compete in rowing, right? Like,
yeah,
like that's the method of that sport. It doesn't mean that it needs to be the method of our sport, because they're fundamentally different activities with different body types, different builds, different mechanics. It all makes sense for that. So I guess we'll just quickly, since we're sort of running lower on time than we expected to be, Joe and I co-presented on Strength Training 101, which was designed to just sort of answer basic questions on strength training, provide a starting point for rowers and coaches in the audience of all different levels. People coach juniors, masters, collegiate rowers, all, club, varsity, all sorts of stuff. And so we wanted to be able to provide a starting point for all of those, and then how to progress from there. So Joe did a rundown on fundamental strength training principles and their applications to rowing. And then I talked about why strength matters for rowing, both for performance as well as for technique. Now, Joe and I have both written articles summarizing our key points from that presentation. And then we also recorded the audio from our presentation, and I've synced it to our slides with some added graphics so the audience at home can sort of know what we're talking about. And we're making that available with this podcast and the articles, and so we're kind of looping that all in together. But so I think we can sort of save the recapping on that and instead just direct folks to our respective blogs and available presentations. Good. But basic idea, then Blake, we gave you a shout out in that too. You tweeted once on why strength matters for rowing was increase your strength, decrease your effort per stroke, improve your endurance. That's like, I mean, the most concise definition of strength training from a performance standpoint. And so we had like a little picture of your tweet on there too. So it was like the three of us were all.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I didn't know I was part of it.
If you get a bunch of followers, then that's why. But then it's also important for technique, and that was how I started coaching, was just riding along with the head coach at Western, just sitting in the launch, listening to what he said, the technical cues that he was trying to get the rowers to use, and the same problems that he kept running up on. And then he and I started brainstorming just like what else could be going on there, either as a mobility or structural limitation or as a strength limitation, that you can say sit up all you want. If the athlete's not strong enough in the torso and strong enough in the scapular muscles to actually sit up in the first place, let alone maintain it for 2,000 meters, then we need to be building strength. So what we wanted to get at was like, drills are great on the cognitive side, get athletes on the same page with each other, as well as with the like stroke philosophy of the coach. If the athlete can produce the motion in a low load environment or in a slow speed environment of a drill, but it falls apart under full speed or full pressure rowing, then there's something else going on there. That's a strength and fitness issue, not anymore as much of a technical issue. So what Joe and I wanted to present was basic errors in stroke and basic ways using body weight, low load resistance bands, and then progressing into weight room training for what rowing coaches can do to start making some of those physical corrections. So you can just stop banging your head against a wall thinking, oh, well, why doesn't the athlete just get it? As well, because something in their body is letting them down. And that's kind of our job as rowing coach and strength coach to help correct that. It was fun. I think we had a lot of Q&A and people seemed into it at an ideal level.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to the summary and recap there is just I think one of the things we were both trying to make sure everybody walked away with was a perspective that, as you said, just because there's some limitations or breakdowns in the athlete using the example, if they're going to a higher cadence or higher intensity, and you start to see technique fall apart, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a conditioning. It could be a strength deficit or vice versa. So I think opening up their mind to there's other things to address that will inherently help their technique and their performance, and looking at as sort of total athletic development, not just staying in the with the horse blinders on and looking at rowing purely.
Yeah. And then too, like trying to give people tools to what you can do with land time beyond just jumpies and sloppy push-ups and planks, because that, I know, like that drives all three of us crazy. That like our strength training methods get condensed down to just advanced babysitting, basically, for like, oh well, we have 20 minutes, so we're going to do a bunch of burpees with really sloppy form, and they're going to get more fit and then be able to row better. It doesn't make any sense. Like, you can do actual things with well-designed circuit training and thoughtful, like this movement for this reason. But that's our job as strength coaches and ultimately sort of coach educators to like get that material out there. So that was fun to see the audience start to pick up on those things and hopefully figure out how they can put that knowledge to work in their training context. Yeah. Well, so I guess that's the end of our prepared materials. Again, we wanted to just do this podcast just to get back on the board, get things going again, catch everybody up on what we're up to. So those were our presentations. Again, we're going to have show notes as always up on rowing.chat. We're the Strength Coach Roundtable podcast. I'm Will Ruth of rowingstronger.com. That's Joe DeLeo of leotraining.io, right? And then Blake Orlay of rowingstrength.com. With all of our respective social medias and stuff. We'll have all of this in our Rowing Chat recap. And then also with links to where you can read our blogs, purchase the presentation if you'd like to see the full version. And then feel free, as always, to ask questions, leave it in the comments, email us. We're readily available for further feedback and discussion. Anything you guys want to add before we wrap up?
Nope. That was fun. Thanks for having us. Glad we got to do it.
Thanks to everybody for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks. Thank you again to our sponsors, without whom this would not be possible, to keep the lights on at Rowing Chat. And then also to thank you to the Joy of Sculling conference organizers for inviting us to the presentation to share with the other coaches, and then also for allowing us to make this material available. We asked their permission to make the audio recordings available, and they granted that. So it's really nice to see, like, not hoarding of information, but allowing us to disperse and distribute. So thank you to them as well. There was a lot of talk about that being the last one. I hope that's not the case, because it's a great conference and a great group of coaches. So we'll see what happens for 2020. But that's all for now. Thanks again.